Hi, and thank you so much for joining this webinar and for your interest in prioritizing you. My name is Madeline Gordon, and I created this podcast. I'm a senior in high school, and I created this podcast to be a voice for other teenagers who are the same. Hi, and thank you so much for joining this webinar and for your interest in prioritizing you. My name is Madeline Gordon, and I created this podcast. I'm a senior in high school, and I created this podcast to be a voice for other teenagers who are the same age as me and experiencing the same things as I do. I hope to be able to be relatable as well as enlighten others through interviews and sharing my own experiences with self-love and social media. Before we get started, I want to first make sure that you all have filled out the pre-podcast survey, which I have put a link to in the chat, because I will be playing one of my podcasts as a part of this webinar. In addition to this, I'll put the link to the post-podcast survey in the chat so that all of you can fill that out after listening. Thank you so much. The first thing I want to talk about is why I started this podcast in the first place. Well, it's for my Gold Award, as I'm sure most of you know, but it also is something that resonates with me and aligns with my values. My podcast is a culmination of my own experiences on a journey of trying to love myself as I am, and I hope that being vulnerable and sharing these experiences as well as what I have learned from them will help others to implement changes in their own lives. I feel very strongly about the importance of prioritizing yourself above all else and also about the role of social media. So let me explain why. I got my first social media app when I was in the 6th grade, and it was Instagram. I posted a bunch of random pictures that I'm pretty embarrassed of today, and at first the app was very casual and fun for me. Eventually, though, I began to understand the hierarchy of people on social media based on followers, likes, and comments that each person receives, and I began to see how I didn't get as many likes or comments as the popular girls of my middle school, and how I didn't really look like them either. I started to take my posting very seriously. I would do photo shoots in my backyard for hours by myself, literally just for the purpose of posting the pictures on Instagram. I would edit them until they were perfect enough to post, and then I would sit anxiously by my phone for the likes and comments to stream in. I wanted more followers, so I would spend hours following and unfollowing people so that they would follow me, but my ratio was still good. I learned that ratios were a thing that people cared about. I would have never noticed the ratio of my followers to the amount of people that I followed, but other people did, so I began to as well. By 7th grade, I had downloaded Snapchat, TikTok, and Visco too. Snapchat was fun at first. I got to play around with filters and take goofy pictures with my friends. However, soon it became about who had the biggest streaks, who snapped the most boys, who had the most unopened snaps, and who had the highest snap score. I began to multi-snap random celebrities just to get my snap score up, and that was a hack that I found on TikTok. I would literally spend hours snapping random celebrities so I could have a high enough snap score to seem cool, even though I doubt anyone was actually checking my snap score. Actually, one time Charlie D'Amelio opened one of the hundreds of snaps that I sent to her, which was honestly more embarrassing than it was cool. So then I decided to stop the multi-snapping. Snapchat now is still all about comparison, especially because all you do is send pictures of your face to other people. I mean, it's kind of weird when you think about it. If someone snaps back fast, they think you're attractive and they're interested. If they take a long time to respond, you check their snap score and make sure they aren't ignoring you or snapping other people. If they unadd you when you send a snap, that means they think you're ugly. And the thing is, on the internet, people are ruthless. People feel like they have a shield, their phone or tablet or computer, that protects them enough that they can do and say whatever they want. So, yes, I have gotten unadded because someone thought I was unattractive before. My friends have too, and even though sometimes it seems funny, it hurts and it really deflates your perception of yourself. As for TikTok, that app was never really innocent to me. As soon as I downloaded it, I had a flood of videos of other girls. I learned that if you were attractive, your videos got onto the For You page and got attention, and if you weren't, your videos didn't. I became obsessed with the idea of getting TikTok famous. I made at least 10 different accounts to try to be famous for being pretty. I would make dancing videos, makeup videos, and videos where I thought I looked good. Sometimes I would get on the For You page and get a few views, but if I got any comments, they were comments making fun of me. I really thought that I was pretty until I downloaded TikTok. Before TikTok, I genuinely don't think I can recall having any insecurities. I didn't even really know what the feeling of insecurity was. However, after I downloaded TikTok, I became extremely conscious of my nose, which is bigger than the average white European nose that completes the beauty standard. I began forming habits outside of TikTok to hide my nose shape. I would cover it with my hands, I would face people in a certain way so they couldn't see my side profile, and I dreaded having to stand side by side to someone so that they would have to see the side of my nose. Other than my nose, the biggest insecurity that TikTok gave me was of my body. More and more videos of extremely thin girls with an hourglass figure began to pop up on my For You page. And the thing about TikTok is that once you start to dwell on a certain type of videos, they begin showing you those videos more and more. And this is a part of the TikTok algorithm. As I began to watch these videos more and more, they became my whole For You page. I would spend hours on TikTok just staring at the bodies of other girls who looked nothing like me. I was skinny too, but my body shape was nothing like theirs. I had a boxy body, and I was more skinny fat than toned per se. I began to search for workouts that would give me a body like these girls, and on YouTube and on TikTok, the workouts were advertised as if they could actually change your body shape, which now I know is literally impossible. Genetics and bone structure play a much larger role than workouts ever could because you cannot change your genetics or your bone structure. You could change your bone structure with surgery, and I learned from social media that people do actually get ribs removed to have more of an hourglass shape. At the time, this seemed like a totally normal thing to do. If I had had the resources and money to do so, I 100% would have. But being extremely naive, I truly did believe that doing these workouts would make me look just like fitness influencers such as Chloe Ting and Pamela Reif. When quarantine began in March of 2020, I put all of these negative thoughts about my body into action. I decided I was going to change my life and start eating and exercising so that I could look like the woman I was exposed to 24/7 on social media apps. I began doing one YouTube ab workout a day, but I had a goal to achieve, which was to get my dream body by the time my family was going to the beach in June. So this one ab workout didn't feel like enough for me. I started to eat healthier and forced myself to cut out any junk food that I used to eat regularly, which caused my cravings for these foods to get worse and worse. I was essentially torturing myself by not letting myself eat my comfort foods in moderation, but I had a goal in mind and I was going to reach it. I started to do 2 or 3 ab workouts a day, and not only did I eat healthier, but I started to eat less. I don't want to go into further detail than this because it could be triggering, but by the time we did go to the beach in June, I had a definite eating disorder, and I was also very much in denial about it. I grew even more reliant on social media. I needed the validation to tell myself that all the struggling I was putting myself through was worth something, and that other people appreciated how thin I had gotten. Social media became my best friend. It became motivation for remaining at a low weight. It became punishment for still not looking as good as the other girls, and a reward system because I got validation for my body and looks whenever I posted. Nobody told me that I looked unhealthy except for my parents, and I thought that meant I was doing the right thing. But I was admitted to inpatient treatment in October of 2020, and this is when my self love journey began. This is why it is so important to me. I've been working towards not a goal, but propelling myself further and further along a journey to love myself ever since 2020. I committed myself to the actions first. You know the saying, fake it till you make it? I firmly believe in that because sometimes your actions have to come before your beliefs, and your beliefs will change if you remain consistent in your actions. I ate according to my meal plan for weight gain, and I attended my group therapy meetings, and I did what they told me would get me out of treatment. When I was discharged in December, I struggled still with relying on validation. Instead of validation from my eating disorder, I now relied on men for validation. I would talk to a ton of guys to prove to myself that people found me attractive because I still didn't believe it myself. However, this backfired eventually because of a saying I'll be discussing. Uh, this backfired eventually because of a saying that I actually talked about in my most recently published podcast, which is you have to love yourself before you can love someone else. I'll get more into that, or I get more into that in my podcast. But basically, I hit a very low point in terms of self love because I realized that these boys are temporary, but I'm stuck with myself for my whole life. Thus, I had to commit to learning how to love myself without relying on someone else. The way I did this was by doing something for myself to make myself proud. I began going to the gym, and in a healthy way this time. I built muscle, and I became more independent and strong mentally and physically than I had ever been. I worked hard, both in the gym and outside of the gym, to craft a person that is confident enough in herself, her body, and her values that no person can deter her from her self love journey again. And I want to help other people get to that point, hopefully without all of the struggles that I've had to go through to get there. Well, that was my background for the podcast, a little bit long, but what I'd like to do next is talk about my first three podcasts, what they're about, and what I learned from them. So, the first podcast I'll be talking about is an episode with me and 5 students from my school who volunteered to be interviewed. The episode is titled Advice on Self Love and Social Media from 5 Voices. And I will be playing this episode for you all shortly so you can get a bit of an understanding of the vibe of the podcast. I learned a lot of new things about the people I interviewed for the podcast. I learned that some of them were a lot more confident in talking about self love and how they implement it in their lives than others. I learned that some people have had experiences where they were heavily influenced by social media, like I was, and for other people, social media is more casual or even positively influences how they view themselves by promoting diversity. From this, I learned that social media is very, very personalized. The feed and algorithm is very personal to you because the social media companies want to create a platform that uniquely interests you and causes you to spend more time on it. For some people, they never fixated on people who were really pretty or had an ideal body. So then that showed up in their feeds much less than it would have shown up on mine. I also learned that most of the students I talked with didn't really have an idea of how to balance the positive and negative aspects of social media, or in other words, how to use it in a positive way where the negative effects are minimized. I think for a lot of people, social media is an all or nothing thing. You are either at 0 or 100, meaning you either don't use the app at all or might not even have it, or you're on it a lot and pretty much addicted to it. When I asked people how to im- when I asked how people implement self-love into their lives, a lot of people were hesitant as well. Some people didn't have anything to say until I prompted them further, and this further affirmed my idea that a lot of people do need to be reminded to prioritize self-love. I also learned that most of the people I talked to had never taken a break from social media that they themselves chose to take, which I think is interesting. And I'll be talking about social media cleanses in a different episode. The last thing I thought was very interesting was that most people said they wish they had been giving social media at a later time. I wonder if this belief will carry into when they have kids and are grappling with when to introduce their own children to screens and social media. But now I'll let you guys listen and create your own conclusions from this podcast. I'll be back in about half an hour. Welcome to Prioritizing You. My name is Madeline. I'll be your host, and I'm very excited to be here with you. I'm 17 and a senior in high school. Welcome to Prioritizing You. My name is Madeline. I'll be your host, and I'm very excited to be here with you. I'm 17 and a senior in high school. I'm here to talk through how to love yourself and prioritize yourself from the perspective of someone who has struggled a lot with both of those things. A few years ago, I very much needed somebody to help me see myself from a different perspective, and I hope I can be that person for all of you listeners. In each podcast, I'll be discussing the various facets of self-love and prioritizing your well-being, as well as how to balance that with friendships, relationships, and living life. I hope you will choose to join the Prioritizing You community and hit the subscribe button. Thanks for tuning in. hope you enjoyed listening to my first podcast. I thought that everyone's answers were pretty thoughtful and some of them were pretty funny too. As for my second podcast, instead of talking about self love and social media with people in my age group, I talked about self love, social media, and disorders that can arise from a lack of self love and overuse of social media with a clinical psychologist named Dr. Jennifer Yellen. I thought it was extremely interesting to learn about the psychological processes behind social media and how that can contribute to a deficiency of self love. I also learned a lot about how Dr. Yellen felt a contrast was established between the way the world worked when she grew up versus the way it is today. She mentioned how it is simply human nature to compare yourself to other people around you, especially during your teenage years when you're still developing. However, when she grew up, she only compared herself to the real people around her that she knew, not people on social media who could edit and change their photographs as well as pick the best photos of them to post. I thought this was very interesting because I wonder how differently I would view myself if I had grown up in that way, without social media, exposed only to the real people around me. The biggest takeaway from this episode was the phrase as is, and that's what I titled it. I would say that Dr. Yellen's greatest resounding point was her idea that self love is loving yourself as is. As for my last podcast, it is a solo podcast on a topic that I am very passionate about, and it is titled You Can't Love Someone Until You Love Yourself, My Hot Take. I don't want to spoil too much about this, but I think that this popular phrase could use a little bit of revision. If I were to revise it, I would say you can love someone without loving yourself first, but this type of love will be unsustainable for a long-term healthy relationship. I hope that you decide to listen to hear more about how I have come to develop this mindset through my own personal experience and others' experiences that I have learned about throughout my life. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. I hope that you learned a bit more about me as a host and about my podcast as a whole. Have a good night.